Here we present the definitive and concise centenary year history of Flying Scotsman, featuring many colour photographs from and in part inspired by the Hornby Dublo Centenary collection, plus, among other things, answer why Flying Scotsman is not the Flying Scotsman at all, yet has looked like more than just one locomotive over the years, been numbered and classed so many times, and much, much more. The most famous locomotive in history, and far, far greater than the sum of its parts. All aboard, good, guard, blow that whistle, let's dive in. Designed by Herbert Nigel Gresley, later being knighted in 1936 to Sir Nigel, and it was he that was given the task to produce a new express engine to replace the ailing Atlantics on the East Coast Main Line, and taking ideas from the newly developed Pennsylvania K4 class over the water, as it were, coming up with the A1 class Pacific. Initial designs were finished in 1922, the first two of which were built in Doncaster by Great Northern Railway, that in this year was also absorbed, along with 26 others, into one newly formed London and North Eastern Railway. The third locomotive of an eventual 52 to be built under the newly formed company was the yet unnamed Flying Scotsman, entering service on the 24th of February 1923. Just simply numbered 1472, and the Class A1s being the most powerful used by LNER at this time. In 1924-25, just before appearing at the British Empire exhibition in London, Flying Scotsman was renumbered 4472, and by a stroke of early PR genius was given the name Flying Scotsman by one of the LNER team. This was a nickname taken and given to the 10 a.m. daily London to Edinburgh rail service, which started in 1862. This service was affectionately known as the Flying Scotsman to many, but was actually originally called the Special Scotch Express until this time. So then the Flying Scotsman became the train service, and Flying Scotsman minus the being given to our 4472 locomotive itself. Simple when you know, yeah? Shoulder to shoulder and on display at the exhibition was arch-rival GWR's Pendennis Castle class, and both companies agreed to swap design information to see which was actually the better engine. Gresley went to work virtually straight away, adding some modifications like superheated boiler, some cylinder alterations, and swapped right-hand drive to left-hand drive, all being implemented whilst GWR rested seemingly on their laurels, content to think they had the slight upper hand. In 1928, Flying Scotsman was also given a new type of tender. This again was designed by Nigel Gresley, with a corridor so new crews could be replaced quite easily from a linked carriage behind, through the tender to the engine footplate. Now, the train no longer needed to stop, resulting in the first non-stop service between London's King Cross and Edinburgh on the 1st of May that year, reducing the journey time down to 8 hours and 3 minutes, and Flying Scotsman was the first there to do it. PR was taking a hold, I guess, and LNER knew the value of it, allowing Flying Scotsman to star in a 1929 film of the same name, which included a chase scene being filmed live down the outside of the train, to which Gresley, when he found out, demanded a disclaimer be signed should anything go wrong. Wise man, yeah. On the 30th of November 1934, Flying Scotsman was the first steam locomotive to officially have done the ton and clock 100 miles per hour on a special test run. And yes, I know many say City of Truro got there first, but not officially, you see. And this test was done really to prove steam still had the speed needed and more pulling power capability than a newly developing two-car LNER diesel-powered engine for new services that were sort of being planned down the line. In 1936, Flying Scotsman lost her corridor tender when A1 and A3s were then handing over to the non-stop services now been allocated to A4 class. LNER locomotives were always painted apple green, but in 1943, during World War II, Flying Scotsman was painted black, after the war becoming green once more, but being rebuilt in 1946-47, having spent a short spell as a Class A10, until becoming a fully blown Class A3 shortly afterwards, with its boiler pressure increased from 180 to 220 psi, to try and match Gresley's more powerful A4s like the Mallard, and it was given that banjo-shaped dome on top that we see continually after this period. Gresley's successor, Edward Thompson, was also devising a new renumbering scheme, so 4472, although initially assigned to Flying Scotsman, then soon became repainted to 502 and 103 after that, until 1948 that is, when British Railways was formed and nationalised. Then almost all the LNER locomotive numbers were increased by 6,000, so Flying Scotsman was again numbered, wait for it, no, E103 for another short period before becoming 60103 that we see today, and was actually painted blue too for a period of time, then the BR or Brunswick Green in 1954, where in this year as well it eventually returned to the King's Cross top shed after spending some time at more leisurely Leicestershire Central and Grantham. After 1957, all A3 Pacifics were fitted with double chimneys and keel chap exhausts to improve performance and economy, but this led to soft exhaust and drifting smoke, which obscured the driver's view. Finally, in 1961, German-style smoke deflectors were fitted to Flying Scotsman to remedy this problem. A little bit late, because in 1962, British Railways announced the withdrawal and scrapping of Flying Scotsman. The days of this iconic engine ruling the rails was over on the 14th of January 1963, where Flying Scotsman, running the 1315 service from King's Cross to Leeds, departed the main line at Doncaster, still numbered 60103, having undergone several operations to improve performance over its 40 years of pulling trains, now falling victim to the price of progress in an ever-changing world, having covered over 2.08 million miles in its working life. Can you believe it? Wow. Fortunately for Flying Scotsman, it had become a bit of a celebrity with railway enthusiasts, and in 1963 a former RAF pilot, Alan Peglar, bought Flying Scotsman, having dreams of driving this locomotive up and down the East Coast Main Line. So after the A3 Preservation Society, forming a group called Save Our Scotsman, failed to raise the £3,000 scrap value, nearly 60k in today's money, after it was turned down also for inclusion into the national collection, a newly cash-rich Peglar stepped in, having secured and been given $70,000 from his shareholding in the Northern Rubber Company when it was sold to Peglar's Valves, started by his grandfather. So he was able to save the locomotive from the scrapman's clutches by buying it off British Railways for $3,500 cash, and immediately began restoring it back as near as possible to its former 1930s condition from the LNER days. So back to apple green? Yes. No smoke deflectors? Yes. By also removing the troublesome double exhaust and renumbering back to 4472? Yes. But the banjo dome remained, and another big yes for me, all under a deal struck with contacts at British Railways and support from the then UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson, later to become Sir Harold Wilson. A lot of sirs in this story, securing permission along with other ministers to run it on the British Railways network until 1971. So when BR banned steam in 1968, this contract left Flying Scotsman able to bypass that ruling. It returned to service on the 10th of April 1963 with a round trip from Paddington, London to a small Wrexham village in Wales, and where over 8,000 people came out all together to see it go by through Birmingham. 1964 saw Flying Scotsman standing on the Forth Bridge for several days, so an artist, Terence Cuneo, could sketch a portrait. 13th of November 1965, Flying Scotsman claimed the fastest steam haul between Paddington and Cardiff at 2 hours 70 minutes, the return also setting a record as well. By the end of this year, Flying Scotsman had recouped the money that Alan Peglar had laid out to buy it. December 1966 saw Flying Scotsman being fitted with an additional corridor tender, which was purchased by Alan Peglar for £1,000 and cost an extra £6,000 to have it adapted as an auxiliary water carrier to hold 11,000 gallons and give the engine a 200-mile operating range, which was needed due to the many water troughs by then being removed from British Railways. This all came off a sister engine 60041, the Salmon Trout, whose boiler and cylinder parts were also purchased at the same time and would come in useful in future years. Unfortunately for Flying Scotsman, on all that rode with her, turntables and coaling stages were also being ripped up at this time, and this would increasingly make life a little more difficult for the last steamer standing on the UK main line. May 1968 saw the 40th anniversary of its non-stop run between Edinburgh and London, and Flying Scotsman was there to make this journey once more. A non-stop return journey was also made 3 days later. Alan Peglar was now beginning to look to pastures new for somewhere else to run his 4472. Believe it or not, he persuaded Harold Wilson in that year to back an idea a year later for a patriotic train to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to promote British exports in the USA and Canada. So here is how Flying Scotsman then appeared to the world once it was embellished with its striking red cowcatcher. That is before it stopped in St. Louis, Missouri, where this was then painted black for some reason. Other modifications included Buckeye couplings, a high-intensity front lamp that we see too, bell, air brakes, and an American-style chime whistle. Why not? To comply with conditions required at that time to run on their rail network. And though steam was by then being regarded as a safety hazard and being banned too in the US, like over here in the UK, with diesel now being seen as the cleaner alternative, along with electric, fortunately, these conditions were lifted for this icon of steam, at least for the most part that is, and though the odd tow to comply through certain areas was probably inevitable anyway and would eat into the budget, Alan was undeterred and so began this epic journey on October the 8th, 1969, and the rest, as we say, is history. Year one was a resounding success, as Flying Scotsman went from Boston, Massachusetts to Atlanta, Georgia, via New York and Washington, D.C., with stops in these various states lasting several days. Well, they would, wouldn't they? And continuing to Slaton, Texas during the winter period. Year two of the journey proved a lot more challenging due to a change in government in the UK. Harold Wilson was out and Ted Heath was in. There was a change of policy and that vital government funding set up a few years earlier was subsequently removed. I can just see Alan Peglar putting on his RAF goggles, determined to carry on as he drew up a revised schedule going on to Wisconsin, Canada, finishing in Montreal in 1970, then onward east to Toronto, south to Niagara Falls, then westwards all the way to San Francisco, with Flying Scotsman displayed on the famous Fisherman's Wharf after the journey's end in 1971, with a total of over 15,400 miles covered and clocked, now on permanent display and drawing the paying public. Well, that is until local restaurant owners complained their trade was suffering due to Flying Scotsman and the train blocking them from view. So Alan was forced to move it to a quieter part of town, into another part of the city, and the money finally dried up. A few trips on the San Francisco Belt Railroad helped, but eventually mounting debt was clocking up too, to the tune of $132,000, which forced Alan Peglar into bankruptcy by 1972. Flying Scotsman was stranded in the US, but not before Alan secretly moved it to a new location at the Sharp Army Depot to save the engine once more from the hands of any future debt collectors who may not have been as keen as him to see things in the same light. Here is a man who had truly lived his dream and has forever secured himself into the heart of Flying Scotsman, all its adoring fans worldwide and the history books as well. He may have had to leave the engine behind on US soil as he worked his way home on a P&O cruise ship, giving lectures about trains and travel to get back. But he really never abandoned this iconic masterpiece and used so many skills and innovations to keep himself and the momentum growing and going over those years. He also became chairman of the Festiniog Railway, and that continues to be very successful. I visited it last year, in fact. I have nothing but the utmost respect to him and whatever he achieved in his lifetime for us all to wonder at, embrace and enjoy today. 1973 saw William McAlpine, with a little bit of a nudge from an horticultural friend, come up with another rescue plan at the 11th hour, like the great man before him, but this time to bring Flying Scotsman back home. Although he already owned Flying Scotsman's arch-rival of Old Pendennis Castle, he had by now the rusting Flying Scotsman quietly been shipped across San Francisco Bay, paying off creditors to the tune of $25,000 and a few more backhanders to turn a blind eye as it was loaded onto a ship and back to Liverpool docks, 3.5 years since it left for just 2. The first steam engine to travel the Panama Canal, and unbelievably when it arrived home, steamed itself to the Derby Works in February of that year for the restoration works to begin. Enthusiasts lined the route. He would keep it running for a further 23 years under his ownership. During a spell of heavy repair work at the Vickers Works in Barrow-in-Furness in 1978, The A3 Flying Scotsman was fitted with a spare A4 boiler, yes, an A4, heavier and putting more weight onto the framework. Some would argue that this put the Flying Scotsman under more stress than it was ever designed to withstand, and I, as an engineer, would be inclined to agree. In 1979, film Agatha also starred Flying Scotsman, and as if almost not to be outdone by Peglar, William McAlpine was about to take our great icon on another mammoth adventure across the ocean. It was a trip to the Australian Steam Festival of 1988, which saw Flying Scotsman there for the bicentenary celebrations. The Mallard had been asked to go at first, but she was at home celebrating the 50th anniversary of her world speed record, and that was a big deal. So Sir William packed up Flying Scotsman along with a kit bag and a few other extras and dived down under, clocking up another 28,000 miles and being the first steamer to travel on the recently built standard gauge line to Alice Springs. Flying Scotsman also double-heading with Australia's most famous steam locomotive, Pacific 3801, a triple parallel run too alongside broad-gauge Victorian R-class locos, parallel runs with South Australian locos 520 and 621, and then even reuniting with arch nemesis, the GWR 4079 Pendennis Castle. Who would have guessed this as they stood together back in 1924 at the British Empire exhibition? My. On the 8th of August 1989, a new record was set for the longest ever non-stop steam run of 422 miles between Parkes and Broken Hill in Australia. Then straight after proceeded to tow its heaviest haul ever of 735 tonnes of train between Tarcoola and Alice Springs on the same trip, covering another 490 miles. Flying Scotsman was also the first steam locomotive to circumnavigate the Earth as well on its journey there and back. Quite strange to feel that I can't seem to imagine that happening now, but there you go. Back home on UK soil in December of 1989, Flying Scotsman was sent for immediate overhaul and on completion painted in BR livery. The double chimney also made a return, and then of course needing the smoke deflectors too. Oh well, you can't have everything, not even William McAlpine. Sir William, that is, because in 1993 he sort of sold off Flying Scotsman by forming a short-lived partnership with Pete Allen Waterman OBE, who took on the business side of things, and as we all know, he's a great railway and model railway enthusiast himself as well. The idea was to pay off Flying Scotsman's outstanding mortgage and run the engine under their new Flying Scotsman Railway Company. Sounded good so far. That was until April 1995, when fate dealt a very cruel blow indeed. Flying Scotsman derailed during an empty stock movement on the Llangollen Railway, all wheels coming completely off the track, which gave rise to a total failure crack report between boiler and front cab when it was assessed. This meant any further running was impossible, and so Flying Scotsman returned to Southall to await its fate. By 1996, financial issues were once again raising their ugly head, and an overdraft to boot, so Flying Scotsman was once again put up for sale. In February of that year, in March, Tony Marchington, an academic entrepreneur and co-founder of Oxford Molecular Limited, which at its height was worth 450 million. He bought Flying Scotsman outright for 1.25 million. Just a mere tad. He also acquired a set of coaches which took the bill up to 1.5 million and spent a further million to get it back on the tracks for the next 3 years, declaring it's quite something to be the man who saved Flying Scotsman. He, I feel unwisely, further put up boiler pressure in the Flying Scotsman from an already loaded 220 to 250 psi and bored out cylinders by an additional inch from 19 to 20 inch in diameter. More stress was then being added to the heavier McAlpine fitted A4 boiler, yes, A4 as we said before, not designed for use on an A3. I wonder what Sir Nigel Gresley would have said to all this. Oh well, first run came on the 4th of July 1999. So he was the man signing the cheques just before the millennium, and Flying Scotsman was there to haul the inaugural Scotsman train from King's Cross to York. The freshly overhauled engine then began special runs around Britain, also hauling the famous Venice Simplon Orient Express Pullmans, starring in Channel 4's A Steamy Affair, for the story of Flying Scotsman, and our hero made the regular but very memorable journeys on the Settle to Carlisle run, a line that was still facing and had to overcome many years of its own troubles with constant closure threats, helped, I'm sure, and eventually saved in part by the attention gained as pictures flooded our hearts of this famous Flying Scotsman crossing the Ribblehead Viaduct. Some things from the past are worth keeping because they become priceless. Flying Scotsman stands testimony to this. As the century turned in the year 2000, Flying Scotsman starred also in a short appearance in a live-action comedy film, 102 Dalmatians, which was the sequel to the 1996 film 101 Dalmatians with Glenn Close as the infamous Cruella de Vil. Marchington must have thought Edinburgh City Council was a bit Cruella as well, because he had an idea for a Flying Scotsman village in 2002 and it was turned down. In 2003 and 4, Flying Scotsman hit the headlines again with yet another crisis over its ownership, when another costly overhaul proved to be going wildly over budget at £1 million, and like Alan Peglar before him, with decisions then being made beyond his control, shares were suspended as debts grew to 1.5 million and losses of 619,000 were announced as well, meaning bankruptcy hit another owner of the Flying Scotsman. Although being turned down for inclusion into the National Collection back in the 60s when Peglar stepped in, by 2004 that was going to be pretty hard to ignore, and the National Railway Museum spearheaded a campaign to save Flying Scotsman for the nation, as fears grew that the sealed bid auction announced could result in Flying Scotsman leaving our shores for good. And that wasn't going to go down well with anyone, was it? It was enough to wake and shake everybody up. 350,000 was raised from the public. Richard Branson matched that. The National Heritage Memorial Fund secured another 1.8 million grant, along with another 70,000 from the Yorkshire Post newspaper, all to keep the loco on British soil, and the NRM won the day, paying £2.3 million, which was 15% higher than the second highest bid. This sale included a spare boiler from 1944 that was used between 65 and 78, yes, by Alan Peglar himself, those spare cylinders, and a Mark I support coach. It was exhibited as part of the museum's Rail Fest in June 2004 to celebrate 200 years of rail travel. 2004-5 saw Flying Scotsman hauling trains across Great Britain, but by now it was becoming very apparent indeed to all, apart from those at the NRM that mattered, that is, that Flying Scotsman was in need of some very major work. Critical faults had been missed at the time of assessment when Flying Scotsman was brought in-house, and the skills and resources needed were still being missed. The media and the public were getting impatient. Time was being wasted and money was being spent unnecessarily. So finally in 2015, decisions were made to outsource the work. And this was won and done by Riley & Sons E Limited of Bury. Money and time had already been wasted on the A4 boiler fitted in the McAlpine era, but after much debate, it was deemed to be in worse condition than the spare A3 boiler they had. So this was decided the best option, and rightly so, I think. It's an A3 locomotive. Serious latent defects in the locomotive's frame too were spotted, which I myself also spotted and photographed as I stood looking down into the repair bay all those years ago at the NRM, which resulted in costly and embarrassing reworks and endless setbacks, but eventually the job would get done. By the 7th of January 2016, 300,000 over the estimated 2015 figures, Flying Scotsman finally stood back in the light of day, running under her own steam for the first time since 2005, and low-speed tests were run on the East Lancashire Railway. On the 6th of February that year, saw an inaugural run with the Winter Cumbrian Mountain Express from Carnforth to Carlisle, 60103 on the smoke box, and its L&ER wartime numbers 103 and 502 on its cab sides. After this saw Flying Scotsman take on its BR green livery and professionally applied 60103 number, returning yet again to London's King's Cross on the 25th of February with a run back to York. Thousands lined the route, with the train being forced to stop, as it has had to do several times since, when members of the public were found trespassing on the line. In April 2016, Flying Scotsman attended the Severn Valley Railway Specific Power Weekend, all 7,000 tickets selling out in just one day, and which in total attracted 15,000 people over the 5 days, turning over £2 million in revenue, and this year saw a full appearance in an animated comedy based on Thomas and Friends. You do know Flying Scotsman is related to Corden, don't you? I digress. Not to mention the many TV documentaries and even train simulation games. Not forgetting all the books and magazines too. We could be here all night, couldn't we? In 2018, 6 years after Peglar's death, it hauled the Farewell Alan Peglar special from King's Cross to York. This was organised by his daughter, and in his will, Peglar had requested for half of his ashes to be placed in the firebox of the Locomotive as it ascended Stoke Bank. The climb was accompanied by a long blast of the whistle as passengers on board gave a moment of silence. Wow, how fitting. In January 2019, Flying Scotsman again hauled a non-stop Scotsman's salute from King's Cross to York, this time as a fitting tribute to Sir William McAlpine following his death in March 2018. Pete Waterman, meanwhile, continues to be a keen railway enthusiast, and the final private owner of Flying Scotsman, businessman Tony Marchington, who had also once owned LNER Class A44464 Bittern, died on October the 16th, 2011, aged just 55. All these men having helped secure Flying Scotsman for us all to enjoy in the future and the years to come. April 2022, the engine was withdrawn for an overhaul in preparation for its centenary year in 2023. Following the work, it was certified to run on the main line until 2029, after which it will run solely on heritage railways until 2032. It appeared again at London's King's Cross as a static display for a 2-day event to commemorate the 170th anniversary of the station's opening on the 14th and 15th of October 2022. In celebration of turning 100 in February 2023 this year, Flying Scotsman took part in various events between March and going forward up until December, including static displays, runs on the main line and visits to heritage railways. A special 100 Voices exhibition at the National Railway Museum. £2 commemorative coins have been produced by the Royal Mint London, some of which were in colour, inspired by their locomotive's apple green livery, yay, which marked the first colour coin produced in over 20 years. Royal Mail has produced sets of stamps designed by David Gentleman, which were the last to feature a silhouette of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Other stamps are also available too, and Poet Laureate Simon Armitage released a new poem entitled The Making of Flying Scotsman. On International Women's Day, Flying Scotsman was for the second time in its history operated by an all-female crew. So here we are, 100 years on, and it is said the rear 2/3 of the frame and cab sides and possibly the driving wheel splashes are the only original parts left on this great locomotive. What's your favourite era? And look for the Flying Scotsman as we celebrate this centenary year with a 6973 incarnation being mine, either single or double tendered, but as long as it's got 4472 in apple green, round stacked and banjo domed, Alan Peglar on the footplate, I'm home. For anyone interested, I've also linked a report into this video from 2012 by Robert Manley and Roger Kemp to give a brief history and in-depth look into the extensive works carried out and to draw on lessons and conclusions with recommendations, not finger pointing at anyone, since Flying Scotsman was purchased for the nation in 2004. It's a very real insight into the reasons for the 5-year setback, the NRM failings and cost escalation to 4.2 million, maybe to help us in the future for the next national treasure that needs saving. So there we are, and there we have it, the definitive and concise centenary year history of Flying Scotsman. Let me know in the comments below if I've missed anything, of course, but let not our comments, feelings and thoughts divide us, but rather fuel and further unite us as one, because without that and each other to bounce off, we wouldn't be here, and neither would Flying Scotsman. Raise a cup of kindness yet, for here's to Auld Lang Syne, which simply means here's to times gone by, or like the beating heart of this great Scotsman, a reminder to us all that the most valuable things in life are actually priceless and outweigh the price of progress that may threaten to label or undermine it eventually. My love to you all, and Flying Scotsman. Happy 100 years. Most of us won't be around on your next centenary, but we've all done our little bit to play a part, because I'm sure you will be. Happy birthday.